The following podcast is a little fiery but mostly peaceful. If you're an automaton, turn away now and shelter in place. If you're a Catholic ready to renew your prescriptions of red pills and white pills, stay tuned. Hello and welcome to Catholics Aren't Zombies. I'm your host, Chris Beanier. Delighted to have you again. Well, here's a topic that you're not allowed to talk about. You're not allowed to criticize the black community, and I'm sure you've already figured this out. I'm sure you figured this out 10, 15, 20, however many years ago. If there's a third rail you're not supposed to touch, it's not Social Security, it's not any of those other things that people panic over. No, there's one thing and one thing particular. You do not criticize the black community. But you know what? Here at Catholics Aren't Zombies, we touch whatever rail we want because we're not cowards, because we don't shirk away from duty when it comes to telling the truth. We don't wimp out. We embrace the virtue of fortitude, which includes the sub-virtue of courage, and we talk about things that need to be discussed. But before we get to that, I want to make sure that we have the most appropriate level of analysis. Because we really are talking about communities and cultures. We're actually not talking about quote-unquote race. Race is this concept that's been forced upon us by the leftists, the elitists, the eugenicists, our buddies who bring us all the other crap we don't like. This is a rather new concept that they've thrown at us in recent decades, century and a half, whatever it's been. We don't have to use their framework. We don't have to use their level of analysis. We don't have to assume, for no reason whatsoever, that this is a genetic discussion, that we're talking about anybody's hereditary makeup. We're not. Because race, for the most part, is a nebulous BS kind of concept. Nobody can ever define it appropriately. Culture's hard enough to define, but nobody ever defines race appropriately. It's incredibly amorphous. It's very confusing. You can't tell one race from the other, and just as soon as you think you can, the mainstream folks change it for us how we're supposed to look at it. So it's really confusing, and you're totally putting yourself into the wheelhouse of these manipulative folks by catering to this in any way, shape, or form. So we're not talking about race. White race, black race, whatever. Those aren't races anyway. But we are talking about culture. And America has many different subcultures. As a matter of fact, I don't really, at this point, believe that there is an American culture. We're maybe at best a composite of several subcultures. White, black, Asian, Hispanic, and it breaks down even further than that. And one of the big takeaway points I want to make today is that all of the American subcultures are basically on a race to the bottom. This is unfortunate. I'm not happy to report it. But if it helps you take solace, that one great equalizer is, we're all kind of screwing up one way or the other. Also, before I go any further with this, as we look at it on the cultural level of analysis, in order to avoid making logical fallacies, we are, of course, not talking about anybody specific. We're not talking about particular individuals. Culture is a group. This is a group that has something germane and common to it. That's what a culture is. But we're not talking about anybody in particular. So you don't take the knowledge or the understanding that you have of a culture or a group and apply it to an individual, or vice versa. That's a really big, bad thing you don't want to do, and you'll look like an idiot and that's never taken a formal logic course. All right, with all those caveats, what is the current state of affairs for black culture? Now, I didn't bring a whole truckload of data. I've written a little bit about it. People have talked about it. But let's be frank. Amongst all of the cultures in America that, as I said, are in decline, unfortunately, because of statist and government manipulation, the black culture, unfortunately, is winning this awful race, this race to the bottom. How do I verify that? How do I prove that? Well, see, what has happened is that you can see it in their family structure. You can see it in maybe educational attainment to some extent. But in a lot of ways, you can see it in just good old-fashioned behavior. Things have totally tanked for the black community, which tells you that there is some hope, because it was at one point very good. Black culture is not hopelessly doomed any more than the rest of us are. But we can tell that there has been a decline, because we can tell where the decline originated. And if we're honest about it, ultimately the origin was at the tail end of the Civil Rights era, with the administering of the Great Society programs. The Great Society, administered by those wicked Democrats that I've talked about, has gripped black culture ever since then, and with free stuff and all kinds of manipulation, has torn that community completely to shreds. They went from being more closely knit family-wise, better or lower divorce rates, fathers fathering their children, mothers and fathers, actually staying married. They were better. They were arguably the best in all of America. Now they're the worst. Now you're talking what? 25% of children raised by a married mother and father? 25%. Now again, the other cultures are doing pretty awful too. Everybody's been on a nosedive for the last several decades. But black culture has gotten the worst the fastest. Why is that? Again, they were the ones at the end of at the end of the Civil Rights era and the beginning of the Great Society that were manipulated the most by the Democrats. They were the ones that were promised the most. They were the ones that were told unequivocally that the Democrats were the only option for them. And with all of that, they became slaves to them. That's sad. Because we're all familiar with, the mid-Atlantic slave situation and what that was like for the first 100 or so years in the American Republic. Well, multiple 100 years if you go back to early colony times. But yet, 100 years after the culmination of the Civil War, they had entered into a slavery arguably exponentially worse than the shackles that they had pre-1965. That's amazing. You're not allowed to talk about this stuff either. Because even just this is enough to get you kicked off the YouTube, the videos get banned, whatever. But look, I'm here to tell you, I don't care. We peddle in truth. If if I'm going to get canceled, I'm going to get canceled. As I've said before, conservatives and libertarians, it's time to just say it anyway. Just do it anyway. Let your yes be yes, your no be no. There's right and wrong. You choose right. Don't do wrong. That's it. And then you make peace with God. That's just how these things work. So what are some other examples of what I'm talking about, though, in terms of bad behavior? And again, like I said, the other cultures, it's a shame I have to keep repeating this, the other cultures are not doing great on these kind of things either, but this is something, you see it firsthand. There's data that supports this. I've seen it personally, and it's, I know nobody believes anecdotal evidence anymore, but then again, I don't know why anybody believes data the way it's cooked up these days in academia. Black culture has most definitely led the way in absentee fathers and baby mamas. If you talk to black folks, you never ever hear the terms husband and wife. You hear baby mama, baby daddy all the time. That's not an accident. They have abortions like crazy. They're especially in the urban areas, New York City, Chicago. What's about 50% of the abortions? Here's one I've seen, and nobody talks about this. Every time they get their tax rebate in January or February, usually takes a little early February or so, they all rush and quit their jobs. If they're the folks that have a $12 an hour, $15 an hour or lower than that job, they quit it because they know they're going to get, $2,000, $3,000 in a check. That's like, 2 months paycheck for them. They just quit their job. It's like, hey, they could live for free and chill for a little while. It's short-sightedness, but that's what's been inculcated into them by these elitists ever since the late 60s with the ramping up of the welfare state. That's what's been drilled into them. It's that mentality, that short-term instant gratification mentality. So there's a complete loss of delayed gratification. And because most of us realize, say what you will about your job, you're not going to quit it just because all of a sudden you come across a month or two's worth of income. Most of us are doing whatever career or occupation we have because in the long run we see there being a benefit. And I say that as somebody that doesn't like 5-year or 10-year plans. But you don't just quit your job just because you got some of your tax money back. And let's be honest, most of the time that happens because they didn't have their taxes set up in the first place. Otherwise, they would have kept all of it. It's a mess. No embracing of delayed gratification, and it's abundantly obvious. Poor dietary habits and obesity. See, I'm used to hearing the AOC side of the political spectrum always tells us that, oh, you know what? People behave the way they do because, they're poor. These are bread riots. They're not getting enough food or bread. They're poor. This is the immiseration of the proletariat. Except, wow, this is the first time in human history that the proletariat is 50 to 100 pounds overweight. Highest rates of obesity, pretty much, there's no dispute there. How about pollution on the highways? You ever get off of a highway or get onto a highway entrance after coming out of a, mostly black community? The whole darn thing is trashed. They throw their trash around like all over the freaking place. White people do it too. White people, it's more likely to be alcohol, I've noticed. Go up to Wyoming or Montana, which I've done fairly recently. Oh, yeah. Jack Daniels bottles all over the place. But nowhere near the same volume of trash. But I'm wondering, what is the deal with so much more garbage getting thrown around? They always chunk all their crap out the window. Now, what does that have to do with poverty, with economic inequality, with being abused by whitey or whatever the heck you want to call it? Why does poverty and supposed alienation and all that, what's that got to do with taking your trash and chunking it out your car window? I'll never understand that. I wish somebody would help me with that. Whenever you point out these things, automatically there's that stupid refrain. That's not charitable. That's not charitable. That's not nice. You're a racist. You're a racist. As again, to shut down conversation, all part of the cancel culture, which again, like I said, at this point, I don't care. Bring on the cancellation. Hit the mute button. Whatever. I'll go find something else to do. But I'm at least going to go down trying. The cult of nice is unwilling and afraid to ever say anything about the black community. That is uncharitable, if you ask me. We're not willing to help them. We're not willing to tell them, hey, you've been duped and manipulated by the Lyndon B. Johnsons of the world, by the Bill Clintons and the Barack Obamas of the world. All they do is string you along and promise you free stimulus checks every now and then. Meanwhile, if anybody was paying attention, your family life went down the tubes. Your neighborhoods just get worse. You live in cities like Baltimore, Detroit, Compton, wherever, and those places just get worse and worse and worse. And this is not because there's something reprehensibly evil about any particular group or particular people, but when as a community, as a culture, you turn a blind eye to obvious systemic manipulation. It's not systemic racism. You're being systemically manipulated. And when you turn a blind eye to that, somebody has to intervene and tell you. And if nobody tells you, then there's your lack of charity. There was too much respect of man's opinions and insistence on maintaining one's reputation above all else that we're too afraid to tell the truth. So we respect other man's opinions. We do not respect the truth. And we can definitely tie the sexual revolution into this stuff because that happened at the same time. This ugly decline of all of our subcultures goes back to the late 60s. And what else happened then, okay? Yeah, you had the civil rights era. Yeah, you had Vietnam going on. But you also had the summer of 69. You had all that depravity, all that promiscuity and fornication. And you can see it in every culture. The clothing has gotten absolutely worse. I don't mean to sound like a prudish preacher here. But you can go back to the 50s and look at the way everybody was dressed. And they were infinitely better dressed than arguably the nicest people, the people that are dressed nicest today. It's incredible. I mean, let alone if you go back to the 19th century. Oh, boy. Most pronounced with black women. Well, they're the ones you really don't criticize. You might be able to criticize a black dude here and there. Some folks might turn a blind eye. Intersectional stuff, they don't rank as high on the victimology chart as black women do. But look, anybody who's honest about it can plainly tell you that the way black women dress, not all, but most, to quote Jesse Lee Peterson, the way they dress is far and away the most tacky, awful, ridiculous thing you'd ever seen. And if you don't believe me, look at who headlines the tackiest of tackiness at these Super Bowl halftime shows, at these Grammy Awards, at these these music events. Yeah, it's a little bit of Miley Cyrus mixed in there. But I mean, come on, it's the Nicki Minaj, the Cardi B, the black female rap artists are insane. It's ridiculous. There is no excuse. You can't defend it. Now, they'd also like you to believe, like I said, you can't criticize it. And I'm to say, well, you know what? Screw that. I'm going to. Ha ha. Do your worst. I don't care. But the sexual depravity and the way we've, for 3 or 4 generations now have inflicted this on the children. Because that's the other sad aspect of it when you talk about the sex slavery, the molestation, the child sexual abuse. That's hit the black community the worst, too. Young black girls under the age of 15, the rates of which they are molested by an older family member, that's astonishing and sad. No excuse there. You can't blame Whitey on that or whatever, whatever. Whitey's an easy whipping boy, really, when you get right down to it. Because nobody, and there's why the race thing is silly and stupid, nobody really identifies very seriously with white. We used to identify with things like German, Italian, French, Polish, etc., Irish. Nobody's ever really identified with white anyway. So this mythical, mixed up, synthetic boogeyman they've created is absolute nonsense. No, but then again, one real boogeyman, the state, has caused them a lot of misery. And I will grant that there is a certain victimhood involved with that. But I do very firmly believe that the black community, black culture, has been manipulated and purposely degraded because the state, in its evil, always does this. It wants to destroy, make dependent, and then they've got a permanent clientele, so to speak. Only a semi-autonomous clientele at that rate. Because, yeah, I mean, okay, it's the land of the free and all that, but in reality, when you're hooked on the cycle of welfare, it's not cycle of poverty, it's cycle of welfare. When you're hooked on that, there is almost no getting out. So this is where we are, folks. To all my listeners who fall into the white category or any other, for those who legitimately are privileged or who are just, can privileged enough to have obtained the truth on some level or can see through the fog a little bit, it is your duty to speak out against this. We've got to acknowledge it. We've got to see it for what it is, see where it's coming from, and intervene the best we can. There's no magic solution. There's no silver bullet, I'm afraid. But you know what they always say, first you have to acknowledge the problem. And just a reminder, too, this BLM stuff, if you haven't figured out by now, it's most certainly not about black lives. It's about Marxism and the destruction of the nuclear family. They've already been successful in destroying their own nuclear families. It's about sexual deviance, voodoo spells. Nothing about BLM is acceptable for any man of goodwill. Shouldn't go anywhere near it. It's terrible. So what can we do? And by the way, this is Catholics aren't zombies. So what can Catholics do to undo this problem? One thing that does come to mind is that we do need to find a way to invite blacks into the Catholic Church. There aren't many. I'll freely admit, every Catholic parish I've walked into, not a whole lot. Not a whole lot of blacks. I live in the southeast, so you'd think there'd be a few. We've kind of slacked on that. And I'm not saying that every parish has to look like a melting pot or anything like that. I don't buy into that scam. But I think we do got to figure out a way to extend the gospel to the black community. No more just, okay, they're over there doing their happy clappy Southern Baptist garbage. We shouldn't leave anybody to that. Watch my other episode that I did on once saved, always saved. The implication of that theology is suicide. It's terrible. It's awful. I think we have this tendency to think that, well, you know what, so-and-so's just, they mumble a few words about God and our Lord Jesus Christ, and, hey, that's good. Hey, they'll be on our side. Well, no, it hasn't worked at all. Hasn't exactly panned out like that. One way or the other. I don't know how easy or, I don't know if I can give you a really clear blueprint on this or a really clear rubric on how to do it, but we do need to figure out a way to invite and welcome blacks more into the Catholic Church. And again, by the way, how it's not a it's not a race issue? Look at where Catholicism really is actually thriving. Africa. Blacks are kicking our butt, just not in America. Just not in America. You head over to the middle southern portions of the African continent, they're taking off. I'd almost rather would be in Rwanda or I don't know what, maybe Tanzania, their president who just died. He was a devout Catholic, conservative, didn't get along with the COVID mob, the global homo medical industrial complex that wants to sterilize and vaccinate everybody. Didn't get along with them too well, and all of a sudden he goes missing, and then they admit he has a heart attack. But either way, those are places. Tanzania, Rwanda, they're on the up and up. They've gone through some ugly stuff, but so there's nothing inherently genetically evil about blacks that renders them incapable of the Catholic faith. Quite the opposite. I predict within the next 20, 30 years, they're going to be showing us up even more. Rwanda, of course, they had their awful, awful genocide back in 1994. Yeah, hundreds of thousands of people hacked up with machetes. Really terrible experience there. That was, of course, predicted by Our Lady of Kibeho. Kibeho, I always pronounce it wrong. It was predicted, and it happened. But that place may be healing itself. What are we doing? Are we healing over here? No. All our cultures are in decline. And black American culture is in decline. It's time we own up to it, because if you don't own up to it, it'll never get better, and we will be held accountable. That's all I got, folks. Dave's Volt, thanks for watching the show. Check out ditchthestateloveholychurch.com, and cue the music.